Okay.
Fun stuff.
My specialty, longue durée.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about some history of colonialism, and we're going to start with Indigenous Americans. So I'm going to laugh because before the podcast we were talking about Aryanism and everything, but there's two big ideologies that pretty much helped the Europeans justify what they did to Indigenous Americans. The first one was Aryan ideology. Anglo-Saxon ideology is really what it was, but it goes back to Aryanism and Calvinism. Aryan ideology. Just give a brief history of where that started. There's some people who believe that sometime a couple thousand years ago, what it's modern day Iran roughly, there's a group of people that were called the Aryans, and they were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, they had beautiful cranial structures, and to play into the caste system of India just for a little bit, went in and killed a bunch of people, and they formed the Brahmin caste, which is the highest of the caste system in India, and then the rest went west, because remember, they have to go west if they're Aryans. And then they went in and colonized all these territories in Europe, and the bad Aryans went and started miscegenating with the Mediterranean people, and they became bastardized Aryans, the Greeks and the Italians and the dark-featured ones, and the Eastern European ones. And then the good Aryans moved up north where Germany and France and England and all of them are, and they became the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes colonized England, they colonized the Welsh, who were the indigenous people there, and started miscegenating there, and they created the Anglo-Saxon race. And then you have the Norman conquest that happened that Aryans don't like to talk about, but there's no such thing as Anglo-Saxon anymore. The Anglo-Saxons died out pretty much after the Norman conquest of 1066. I'm an English literature major. I've had to study English history. It's sad. So that's the Aryan aspect. Calvinism, and Krishna knows a lot about this because he wrote a thesis on Miltonic adaptations of Calvinist theology. Yeah. John Calvin, you've got the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther, and then all these different sects of Protestantism started forming. Calvin was one of the sects of Protestantism, and many of the Protestants that came over to the East Coast and started colonizing the Indigenous Americans were of the Calvinist aspect, not only here, but also in South America with the French Huguenots that started colonizing like Brazil and all these places. Calvinists have this doctrine of post-lapsarianism and pre-lapsarianism, and then super-lapsarianism and infra-lapsarianism. Pre-lapsarianism is before the fall of man, the notion of Adam and Eve eating the apple, and then Satan condemns them and they lose everlasting life. Paradise Lost, that's where Paradise Lost comes from.
It's also a distinct state. Like it's
exactly.
The universe is structured differently in pre-lapsarian setup.
It's a paradise. Yeah. And then because they lost that paradise through transgressing God's law of not eating from the tree of knowledge, they're in a post-lapsarian existence, this hellscape. And this kind of made people think, if these Protestants thinking if we go across the ocean, we go to this new land that's been founded, quote unquote, by Columbus, we're going to go into this utopia, which goes back to Thomas More, utopia in the 1520s, and that we can return to this pre-lapsarian existence if we just go to this new aspect, using our Aryan mythology too. So that's pre-lapsarian and post-lapsarian. Then you have super-lapsarianism and infra-lapsarianism. Infra-lapsarianism is the notion that God elected certain people to be the chosen people after the fall of man. And supralapsarian is God elected people to be chosen before the fall of man. Most Calvinists who move here believed in infralapsarianism, and they used a combination of the noble savage mythology, the ideology of Aryanism, and then Calvinism as a way of justifying that Indigenous Americans were savages they did not belong on this land, and thus we could take this land away from them because they weren't doing anything with it anyway. And this is what formed these hierarchies of oppression for the Indigenous American communities, going all the way from the Pequot massacre, where they literally burnt Pequots alive inside of a cabin. This is the true story of Thanksgiving. King Philip's war with Powhatan, his name was Metacomet. He was Narragansett by the Massachusetts area. And Metacomet fought against the Puritans, but eventually was caught. They decapitated his head, impaled it on a stake, and kept it in front of Jamestown, Virginia for, I think it was 20 years, as like a showcasing of what they had done to Metacomet. A few other Stygian accounts that happened. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend. We have William Henry Harrison, the 9th president of the United States. He was a general during this time, and what they did is they actually went into the Native American the Indigenous American burial grounds and literally uprooted the graves and desiccated the graves as an affront to the spiritual practices of the Nez Perce, which is where they were fighting the Nez Perce at the time. And then my least favorite and probably most horrible, the Sand Creek Massacre in northern Colorado, where the settlers literally massacred the Ute and part of the Comanche, dismembered the body parts, including some of the genitalia and heads and skin. Some of the Native Americans took it as a showcase to one of the theaters in, I think it was Colorado Springs, if I remember correctly, either Colorado Springs or Pueblo, Colorado, and showcased them as trophies to the people there. And just this horrible history of Indigenous American genocide and exploitation that has happened here in the United States. Vine Deloria Jr., who is a Lakota, Nakota, Dakota Sioux philosopher, indigenous philosopher, he's already passed, sectionalizes Indigenous American history into 6 separate sections. The first one he calls Discovery, Conquest, and Treaty Making. This is when the colonizers first came over. They started intermingling with the Indigenous Americans, and they started forming treaties, but then they started conquering them, forcing them to move, breaking treaties, killing them. Some of them did live peaceful, but it didn't last for too long, and that was the first aspect. The second section was removal and relocation. This is where we get aspects like the Trail of Tears with Andrew Jackson, the so-called civilized tribes, which are the 5 tribes that lived in Florida, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Mohawk, and they forced them to go into a modern day, what was then called Indian Territory, now called Oklahoma. But pretty much removing Indigenous Americans and relocating them to separate facilities. This is also where Indigenous American sovereignty comes into play with the 3 Supreme Court cases: Johnson versus McIntosh, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and Worcester versus Georgia. These 3 cases define modern day tribal sovereignty within the United States, where you pretty much have what I call an Imperium and Imperio, where you have a particular amount of governance, self-governance, and sovereignty within a wider governmental sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty within the sovereignty of federalism within the United States were defined in those 3 court cases. The third one, allotment and assimilation. This is where we get the boarding schools. They were taking them and trying to assimilate them and indoctrinate them using those aspects that we talked about in that first slide. Raping them. A lot of people forget that there was a lot of sexual abuse that happened in these schools. If you ever want to not sleep for a couple of days, read what happened up in Canada.
Yeah.
Very, very horrible what had happened.
With the mass graves that they found.
The mass graves, as well as the survivors of them, talking about how, probably going to have to do another viewer disclaimer for this episode too, but physically having to masturbate some of the priests at like 5, 6, 7 years old, because the priests were sexually abusing some of the children. So we have that going on. Another, just a side fact here in New Mexico, you want to talk about spectacle covering up true intentions. Talk about how most of us don't really talk about how one of our streets here in Albuquerque, New Mexico is called Indian School.
Yeah, Indian School Road.
Yeah, just a thought for people who actually live here in New Mexico.
I was thinking about that the other day when I was driving down there. I was like,
yes. So that was the third one. Fourth one, reorganization and self-government. This is where the reservations started getting formed. self-government started becoming a thing. They were using the tribal sovereignty they had gotten from the removal and relocation section to start self-governing within their particular imperiums and imperios. And then the fifth one, which is commonly not talked about unless you're an Indigenous American scholar, is the termination period. This happened from roughly 1945 to 1968. During this time, the government was specifically going into the reservations and physically giving incentives, sometimes physically coercing Native Americans to leave reservations and go and become urbanized into cities because the government actually wanted to take over the land of those reservations for their own public use. And I always tell people, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, when the Civil Rights Movement finally ended segregation in 1954, at the same time, Indigenous Americans were getting kicked off of their reservations and losing their sovereignty. It's this notion that Michael Rothberg calls multidimensional memory, where we forget that certain things happened at the same time and we lose the memory of those things happening at the same time. And then the sixth one, self-determination from 1968 to the modern day. Most Indigenous Americans now have tribal sovereignty, they have the reservations, but they're trying to find self-determination because they realize they have certain amounts of agency based off of their tribal sovereignty, but the autonomy is very drastically discriminatory. The government still encroaches on their lands, still pollutes their water, still allows mining companies and these fossil fuel companies to go into reservations and desiccate the land. There's still the problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's so many problems that are still existent with the Indigenous American communities, and it's a very, very long history. Side note, Vine Deloria, as I said, was an Indigenous philosopher, and he had a lot to say about religion and Indigenous religion versus Eurocentric religion. And he says a lot of tribal religions were very spatial. A lot of Indigenous Americans, depending on which tribal association they're associated with, view religion very spatially, meaning their particular territory that they live in is where their particular belief systems, their cultural norms are practiced and are associated with the symbolic attachment to that. And they say the problem with Christians is that they're so temporally dissected from the spatial origination of their religion that they have no way of understanding their true spiritual intentions.
Yeah, like actually respecting like the original Temple of Jerusalem or whatever. Right?
Exactly. And they say the easiest way to see this is how people in Eurocentric societies bury their dead. Most Indigenous Americans, and even some Muslims too do this, Indigenous Americans will bury their dead usually wrapped up in some type of bedspread or some type of rug of some sort that covers the body directly into the ground because they're attached to that particular land. Whereas when you're in a casket, you're physically separated from that land, and they say that's a physical representation of the temporal and spatial dissection that Eurocentric religions have from the land.
I mean, yeah, like you're even in death, you want to consider yourself separate from a natural landscape or something. Like you are within a special conserved, or like a special environment that's only for you, and you have to be there in order for God to find you there.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is where my master's thesis comes in, because I focused on Indigenous and Chicana feminism for my master's thesis. Paula Gunn Allen, who's a great Laguna scholar, she's already passed, but Laguna is one of the pueblos here in New Mexico. She came up with this notion of the psychescape, which is a particular plot of land that people live in is attached to the psyche of that particular group of people. The affects, the emotions, the cultural, social, political, economic histories, religious, spiritual histories are attached to that plot of land. And to dissect that from a group of people is pretty much to decontextualize them from their own identity. And that is what she calls the psychescape, and that is tied to this whole religious aspect. And all of Indigenous American history here in the United States, and even Central, South, and the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, has been dissected and decontextualized from their original spaces and being forced and sequestered onto these plots of land. And given the false promise of tribal sovereignty, which they do have tribal sovereignty, but very, very limited tribal sovereignty in terms of what they can actually do with what the United States government imposes upon them. Latin American history, this is my specialty because I specialize in Latin American history. So we already talked back in March the history of Spain. I'm not going to go over that because you can go back to that episode to talk about how Spain and Portugal came over here and formed everything. I also kind of briefly talked about the caste system in Mexico and how all of that was put in. Mexico from the 1821, when it gained its independence from Spain, to 1848, was fighting with one another. They have the loyalists who were loyal to Spain still, and then you had the revolutionaries who wanted to completely break away from Spain. And because this conflict had festered, the United States came in 1846, and the Mexican American War started because what President Pierce wanted to expand the cotton monopoly in the United States to Texas, New Mexico, and all of the Southwest territory because they wanted to economically challenge Britain at the time. Because you remember, the United States had just broken off from Britain about 60 years prior, and we wanted to become the dominant superpower. Monroe Doctrine, etc., all that stuff. They wanted to extend slavery, chattel slavery, and cotton monopolization into Texas, and that was why they went into Texas and tried to colonize. Well, they did colonize parts of Mexico. That lasted for 2 years. You also don't want to sleep at night. Read some of the diaries of the soldiers and the things that they did to the Mexicans during this time. That ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of California are taken away from Mexico and gained territorial status in the United States. And each territory gained its statehood at different times throughout history from then on forward. After that happens, 1850s, Benito Juarez is pretty much forming these different constitutions. He's trying to create a more egalitarian society. And then the French, seeing what's happening in the United States with the Civil War, try to invade Mexico. Lincoln is too preoccupied with the Civil War to say this is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, whatever that's supposed to mean. So they're not focused on Mexico. So France invades Mexico. The Battle of Puebla takes place on May 5th, 1862. General Porfirio Diaz kicks the French out of Puebla, Mexico. That's why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo, which has been assimilated by American culture. And Porfirio Diaz becomes this huge national hero. 1876, Benito Juarez gets kicked out by another president, and then in 1876, Porfirio Diaz does a coup d'etat against Lejardo, which was the president after Benito, and Porfirio Diaz becomes the dictator of Mexico from 1876 to 1910. Horrible regime, what he did. Another story that I can't get into, but it pretty much took a handful of anarchists, the Magonistas, Ricardo Flores Magón and Jesus Flores Magón, to come together and fight against the regime. And when the Mexican Revolution breaks out in 1910, they overthrow Porfirio Diaz, and then they put Francisco Madero, and Madero gets assassinated. You get Victoriano Huerta and all these other ones, and it's a mess from there on out. But what Diaz did during his dictatorship was he was allowing the robber barons to come into Mexico and build the transcontinental railroad into Mexico. And what that necessitated was expropriating the land from the campesinos, which is Spanish for the farmers, the peasants, and using that land to build that railroad through, which was caused the Mexican Revolution. All these campesinos were sick of Diaz and what he was giving to the robber barons, and they all got together, Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa and Juana Belena Gutierrez de Mendoza and the Magonistas, and they fought against that. And that's kind of the history of Mexico during this time. Now, just to give like a general overview before I get into Operation Condor, all of Latin America was kind of being controlled by the corporate greed of select few robber barons during the 1800s and 1900s. Each country has its own history of exports and imports, companies going in and taking over the land and expropriating resources. It was called filibusters, where white people would literally come in, go around the town and say, if you don't do what we want, then we're going to shoot everybody here and blow down the town. That happened multiple times, and that's how they took over properties in the Southwest and in Central and South America. Property and water rights, this got very huge during this time. How do we define property rights? Common law is Roman law, abusus, fructus, and usus. Usus is the use value you get from the land. Abusus is your ability to actually abuse the land or destroy the land or sell it on a market. And then, of course, fructus, being able to take the fruits of the labor of the assets from that land. And then water rights, you got riparian rights and littoral rights. We talked about this with groundwater. I've had to study hydrogeology for reasons that I don't want to get into right now. But water rights became a very big thing during this time. And this all festered for many, many years. You had this undulation between progressive governments, conservative governments, progressive governments, and conservative governments. Eventually, what happens in the 20th century is we got this guy by the name of Henry Kissinger. He just celebrated 100th birthday, and I didn't have too many kind words to say about it. There was a lot of scandal that happened in the 1960s through 1970s, and it got all released in 1975 with the Church Committee hearings, which was a committee that was put together by the Senate to investigate what the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the IRS had been doing for the past 20 years. And through the Church Committee hearings, MK Ultra, COINTELPRO, what was called Family Jewels, and Operation Condor didn't because it was happening at the time. And Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, and everything got released as to what the intelligence communities were doing. And there was this wide distrust in the American public against intelligence and governance. This is what laid the bedrock for Reagan to form neoliberalism because of all of this stuff coming out about the FBI and everything. What was not released in those papers was what was called Operation Condor. And this was directly infiltrated by Kissinger and perpetuated by Kissinger. It started before Kissinger was Secretary of State, but Kissinger and Nixon helped perpetuate it. So this starts in the 1950s. We talked about the Dulles brothers with the CIA, how they overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. Next year, they overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala when he tried to nationalize the United Fruit Company. What also happened in 1954, a lot of people don't know, there was another coup d'etat that happened in Paraguay. And the old government got replaced by another man by the name of Alfredo Stroessner. And Alfredo Stroessner was the dictator of Paraguay from 1954 to 1989. In 1989, there was a leak that happened that was called the Archives of Terror. And it was the documentation of all of the human rights abuses that these dictators that I'm about to get to had done in Central and South America. You also don't want to sleep for a couple of nights, read what Archives of Terror, what they did. People like Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic were literally feeding people to sharks alive. They had Stroessner in Paraguay, who literally recorded people getting tortured to death and then sent the recordings to the family members for them to listen to. Horrible human rights abuses. Stroessner takes over Paraguay. A guy by the name of Juan Bordaberry takes over Uruguay. These are all coup d'etats that the United States are involved in. In Bolivia, the former one, Juan José Torres, gets dispossessed, and a guy by the name of Hugo Banzer takes over as dictator. We have João Goulart in Brazil gets taken out in 1964, and a guy by the name of Humberto Alencer takes over. What was significant about this recent election in Brazil when Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva won against Jair Bolsonaro was Brazil hadn't had a left-leaning liberal progressive president since João Goulart was taken out in 1964. And so this is a very significant presidency for Brazil right now. So that was Brazil. In Peru, we had a guy by the name of Francisco Morales Bermudez. He became the dictator of Peru. And then the two most famous ones that most people know about, the military dictatorship in Argentina when Perón was taken out. Peronism is a whole another political doctrine between capitalism and communism. Perón had a lot of problems. Perón allowed Nazis to go into Argentina. He's a national figure in Argentina. Argentina has had a long history of white supremacy, and I won't get into Argentina right now, but Perón was not a good person, but the regime that came after him, headed by Jorge Rafael Videla, was absolutely savage. They were flying people on helicopters and throwing them in the ocean for sharks and other fish to eat them alive. They were torturing people, and then the whole spectacle that I talked about at the beginning was used, the media, to cover up everything that was happening. But the most famous of all, and this is where Kissinger is directly involved, is the overthrow of Salvador Allende, 1973, September 11th, the other September 11th that people don't know about, 1973, when Salvador Allende was overthrown by the CIA, the American CIA, and Agosto Pinochet was installed as the dictator of Chile, and Pinochet ruled with an iron fist for about 17 years until he was finally kicked out. Allende, what's interesting is he actually was trying to form with this guy by the name of Stafford Beer, who was a cyberneticist. He was trying to form an economy that was strictly based off of cybernetics. And it was going to be equally distributed to the peasants and the indigenous and the Afro-Indigenous people in the United States. Last time when I talked about we really have never had a communist country in the world, the closest that the world has ever gotten to a truly communist socialist country was underneath Salvador Allende in Chile. He was actually going to make a massive change. Kissinger and Nixon did not like that, and they overthrew him and put Pinochet into power. You can actually listen to Allende's last speech on YouTube. It's a beautiful speech that he gives before he commits suicide, before the CIA can get to him, as the planes were bombing the palace in Chile. So Operation Condor was Pinochet got together with the Videla and Bermudez and all the other ones, the dictators that have gotten up, and they said, we're all going to work together and have help from the CIA and the intelligence communities to stay in power, dispossess all these people, install neoliberalism in every single one of our countries, continue killing and massacring people in all these countries. I forgot about the Somozas in Nicaragua. There was the Duvalier family in Haiti. And then there was, I'm missing one. Oh, and then the military dictatorship in San Salvador, which was the most violent dictatorship that there was in all of Latin America. And this happened from the 70s all the way to roughly about the early to mid 90s, which is when you had the Yugoslav wars and the Bosnian genocide with Slobodan Milosevic and those other human rights abuses that happened. But all of Latin America has pretty much been marred in bloodshed, dispossession, and neo-colonialism of installing puppet regimes to dispossess these people. And you wonder why we have such a massive immigration problem here in the United States, because these people have no other means of living in their countries because of the economic, political, and environmental devastation that has been caused through these coercive tactics that have been used. And because of that, people are coming here to try to find a better life. That's what Juan Gonzalez calls the harvest of empire. Latin America was always treated as the backyard of the United States, and now we created our own harvest, and now we have to deal with the harvest that we've created because of influx of immigration coming into this country. So that's how colonialism with Latin America. Africa is very interesting. This is where Afrocentrism and Pan-Africanism comes in. Africa was partitioned in 1885 through the Berlin Conference. This is when a bunch of European countries came out together. No Africans were invited, by the way, and said, you're going to take this part, you're going to take this part, you're going to take this part, and they sectionalized Africa, allocated it to different European countries. The Belgians got the Congo. We know what Leopold did there with the rubber. Horrendous human rights atrocities. We got the Portuguese that got Mozambique and Angola and Cape Verde and all of these other places. And the list goes on and on. The Dutch got South Africa, etc., etc. Africa didn't get its self-determination, its, what's the word? Freedom from colonial rule until the 1950s. Ghana was the first underneath Kwame Nkrumah. And then Kwame Nkrumah starts getting together with Jawaharlal Nehru, Nasser from Egypt, and Sukarno from Indonesia, and they form the non-alignment movement, which forms the theories of the Third World, what's now called the Global South, this coalition of Global South countries to fight against these dominant powers of Russia, the United States, and China, and Japan, and Canada, etc. And so Nkrumah's big. You got Sekou Touré in Senegal, Sekou Touré was in Guinea. Leopold Senghor was in Senegal. We had Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, which was colonized by Cecil Rhodes, but Zimbabwe started good. He turned into a dictator afterwards. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and then Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. If you want an interesting socialist history, look up Nyerere's concept of umoja, which was his socialist project that he tried to implement in Tanzania. Then we got dictators. Obviously, Kissinger and the other guys and the people in the CIA did not like socialism, quote unquote, to happen in these countries, so they started doing coups in Africa as well. They took out Milton Obote in Uganda. They put in Idi Amin. We all know about Idi Amin, last king of Scotland. We all know about apartheid in South Africa. At least I hope we know about that. But that had been happening with the Dutch and the Boer population way even before that. They installed Hisenabre in Chad. Massive human rights abuses, massive scale rapes that happened in that country. Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and the list keeps going on and on. Joseph Mobutu in the Congo after the United Nations literally assassinated Patrice Lumumba. And like I said, it was just horrible what happened in Africa. And based off of all this, they formed what was called Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is this African philosophy. There's other philosophies in Africa, such as Ubuntu. There's great African philosophers as like Zira Yacob, Wole Soyinka, Halda Sewat. I'll have to have another episode on African philosophy to get into that. But they pretty much said there's one unifying thing that puts people who are part of the African diaspora together. And that unifying notion is we all came from the same continent and we were all dispossessed and expropriated and decontextualized and put into slavery somehow. Whether you're in the United States, Central South America, the Caribbean, taken to the Indian because we forget about the Arab slave trade that happened too, we're all unified in some way. This was directly opposed to what was called Black Atlanticism, which was formulated by the African-American scholar Paul Gilroy, who said, no, because of this decontextualization that happened, the cultural differences between these groups of the African diaspora are so different that even though we did all come from the same continent, our cultural aspects are too different for us to be able to unify on this front. That's a huge debate in Afrocentric circles. If you take Africana studies, it's a huge debate that happens between professors who are Black Atlanticists or Afrocentrists. But Pan-Africanism, there's 5 concepts. First one, coming to self-knowledge of one's consciousness. Understanding everything we've talked to up a point in this podcast since October. Consciousness, the historical relevance, all of these notions of philosophy and theory and psychology and sociology. 2, using the knowledge to organize coalitions. That's what Pan-Africanism is. 3, act based on these conversations and provide solutions reached through organizing. This is usually when hegemonic powers start seeing this and they don't like this because they're like, these people are getting together, we need to stop them. Hashtag Kissinger and Nixon. 4, reaching prosperity through productivity of this action. If you're allowed to form a coalition and the hegemon's not trying to destroy you in every wake, you start producing things. Worker self-directed enterprises is a good one, but all these other social justice organizations. And then finally, as I just said, people are going to attack you for this, so you need to defend those productivity and prosperity that is gained through that. And that has pretty much been the history, even though it's called Pan-Africanism, it's pretty much been the history of most emancipatory movements, regardless of what that movement has been throughout history. Asia, just to go briefly into it, because we're kind of going a little long, we've got another thing that Kissinger did. What was released in the Pentagon Papers was that there was massive scale bombing campaigns during the Vietnam War that happened in Laos and Cambodia. Yeah. And because of the economic and political destabilization that Kissinger did in Cambodia, this allowed Pol Pot to assemble the Khmer Rouge to rally people into the Khmer Rouge and, of course, commit the Cambodian genocide, which systematically butchered over 3 million people in Cambodia. So that's strike number 2. Strike number 1 for Kissinger was Operation Condor. That was strike number 2. Strike number 3 for Kissinger, I didn't put it on here, but doing a coup against President Sukarno and installing Suharto as the dictator of Indonesia, who then went on and oppressed the Timorese, the East Timorese people, and caused the Timorese genocide. That's strike number 3 for Kissinger. I already talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If there's any other things that people are bugged about that, we'll return to that. Trust me, I'm not afraid to defend myself. I've had to defend myself on many occasions when it comes to that. And then the mujahideen. This goes to what we're talking about now with the war on terrorism. I've been seriously wanting to do a comparative study. I've never seen this done, and I'm shocked this hasn't been done, and maybe I'll be the one to do it, of showcasing how we can create a direct correlation between the U.S. support of the mujahideen in Afghanistan directly to the rise of jihadist movements throughout the Middle East that led to this war on terrorism with 9/11 and the whether it's Al-Shabaab, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's ISIS and the Taliban. These jihadist movements are direct children of the mujahideen, and there has never been, shockingly, a study directly correlating that, and I think I know why, because of this cultural hegemony that has happened. So we understand whether it's East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, or West Asia, colonialism has affected all parts of the world, regardless of what we're talking about. Any questions about that whole history?
Yeah, no, I think like, especially what you mentioned about like the Mujahideen connection at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that is something like we are all pretty much aware of. There have been movies made about it, right?
Yes.
Like Charlie Wilson's War and stuff. But there's still no academic connectivity. There's no like, credible, concrete connection. That's insane. Like how have we not dived into that deeper when it's literally been like what we've proclaimed to be our our biggest existential threat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, terrorism against the U.S. and we haven't even taken the time to really trace its actual, and it's easy because we can just throw it onto the religion or throw it onto a certain group of people and a certain part that we will take to represent the whole religion.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the spectacle comes in. You create a spectacle that decontextualizes the actual thing that's happening. You utilize rhetoric that's been used in the culture wars, and once again, I'll keep reiterating, we need to focus on racism, we need to focus on all of these systematic oppressions that are happening, but the fact of the culture wars and what's called wokeism, it's been appropriated, it's been co-opted by conservative groups and radical groups and used as a justification, a spectacle to hide these intertextual strands that I've been trying to tie for everybody here in these past episodes since October.
Yeah, it's just labels, right? If you just throw like a big, very easy to read label on it, people are just going to read the label and not really look past it, the details.
Exactly. Yeah. Any questions, Pan?
No, I think Krishna already took the words out of my mouth. I was going to comment a very similar thing. So no, it's like I said, it's so in depth what you're trying to like explain to everybody. But I think you're doing an amazing job, and it's pretty easy to follow so far for me.
Perfect. So if we go to the last slide, and this will probably be the shortest one because there's some time constraints that we have to do. I've been promising many episodes already that we need to start moving towards solutions. I've done history to absolute death, and I'll continue to do history in future episodes, but I want to start looking towards the future. And maybe this will just be an entry gateway so that the next time we come together, we can start thinking about this. And this will give both of you time to maybe think about, okay, what are some of the problems we're dealing with? Here's some solutions maybe we can come up with. And we can start having even more democratic conversations rather than just me kind of this spouting all this like economic and theoretical and philosophical and historical information, like using what I already gave as the bedrock to provide solutions. The way that I would like to think of this is through David Scott's problem space theory. He has 3 different ways of doing this. I'm not going to read all this. You can look at this, but problem stage. In this stage, problem is defined, context and constraints are understood, and the goal is to gain a clear understanding of the problem that needs to be addressed. I think I've pretty much kind of compacted that with all the lectures that I've done, context and what the problems are, what that is. So these are the particular steps: identify the problem, gather information, define the context and constraints, formulate the problem statement, and then overall that's over all that. So that's the first one. I think we've already codified what the problems are that we need to address. We may be able to come up with new ones if we do our next episode, but that's kind of the first stage. Second stage, searching for solutions. In this stage, find potential solutions to the problem that need to be generated and evaluated. This stage involves brainstorming, researching, and evaluating different options to find the best solution. So brainstorming potential solutions, maybe we could do that at the beginning of next episode when we meet. Evaluating potential solutions, which ones are more effective than other ones that we brainstormed. Researching and gathering the information to kind of understand how these solutions can be implemented. Selecting the best solution through our research, and then developing an action plan based off of all of those solutions. Either you can upload this or I can upload this into the actual team space so you all can like read this fully for your own benefit for this thing. Yeah. And then the next slide is the last part of it. The third is solution implementation and monitoring. Once we come up with the solution, and I think you're probably both familiar with this, using this even in the utility company, you've probably had to go through this trial and error stage. Implement the solutions, see what's working, see maybe what's not working, and then fix that up by trying to think of new things going back to stage 1 and stage 2. So testing and adjusting, monitoring the effectiveness of that, refining the solution if it's not working, and then communicate the progress in some type of statistical analysis or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the way that I like to think is, how can we start coming up with theories? How can we create like cost benefit kind of charts, even though cost benefit's a little sticky with me sometimes, of understanding how do we make decisions? Well, we go to decision theory, and there's many different ones. Expected utility theory, how much utility are people going to get out of things like this? Prospect theory, given that people have certain subjective beliefs and emotions and certain prejudices, how are they going to perceive those utilities in that particular theory? Decision trees, make huge graphical representations of different decisions and problems and see where they lead. My favorite, game theory. Is this a zero-sum game? Does everybody have agency within the thing? What types of contexts can we put, situations what we put that make arise from us trying to give solutions, and how can we kind of understand what might be happening out of implementation of those solutions by understanding the rational agents that are interacting within this particular thing? And then Bayesian decision theory, pretty much almost the same, just kind of trying to see how beliefs and prejudices affect the probabilities of the different outcomes that happen, and then update those beliefs using the third solution. So just some food for thought for us when we next come back to start trying to think of the future rather than the past and the present.
I'm excited. I mean, what's amazing is like a lot of these things you'll come across when you're like just going through basic like motivational speakers, or even like Napoleon Hill or Zig Ziglar and these guys. You know, set a goal, try to identify the obstacles to that goal, find a workaround to those obstacles, and continue with incremental progress. Right? It's like a simplified version. But I love that we're actually going to hop into these solution theories too, especially like game theory and stuff like that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the last one.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so awesome. So that is all I had for today. Like I said, I just wanted it to be just a continuation of what we've been going through this track from racial capitalism to Marxism, now talking about colonialism as being like the third bedfellow of racial capitalism and economic devastation with capitalism. And I hope that we have this full encapsulating methodology to start implementing these solutions now.
Yes. 9 episodes later, we've got, so I think it's time.
Yes.
It takes time, like we've covered so much, right, across so many different fields, and it's necessary.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, and me and Pan had talked about this after the recording last time, because we had a chance to kind of go back and forth about some ideas, is my biggest critique of academia. And I say you're not a true scholar if you can't critique the institutions that you're part of. If you're not questioning everything, even things that you feel beautiful about and you actually partake in, you're not questioning enough. Yeah. And my biggest critique about academia is we all get degrees in particular specialties. And if you get your bachelor's, master's, PhD, you specialize, you're brilliant, you're a philosopher, PhD, philosopher, doctorate of philosophy in that particular field, but you only know about that particular field. And when you're dealing with political, economic, social, and cultural, spiritual, name all of the above that we've talked about, society, the world, the universe, if you want to go even more farther, you cannot just understand one aspect. You have to understand so many different fields of knowledge and disciplines. And that's why I've spent the 26 years of my life just kind of venturing into so many different disciplines, because I think if you have this huge macrocosmic understanding of everything, you could start patching up the holes that have been penetrated through all of these systems of power.
Yeah, and even if you don't personally have the capacity to patch it, you can create a nice chain of causation that will hopefully lead to that being patched at some point.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'll probably end with that then. If there's any last questions before we end.
Looking forward to the solutions.
No, I just wanted to, also looking forward to the solutions. But I wanted to touch on kind of what you're saying there, which is just like it's having an interdisciplinary approach to these things. So it's just like you have to, like, you know, let's just say someone has a psych background. It's like, okay, you can't just purely operate from a psych. You have to, you know, have neuroscience. You have to incorporate biology theories. You have to have humanistic and like from, you know, human development kind of theories. Otherwise, it doesn't fully encapsulate everything that you kind of want to like talk about, even when it comes down to the individual, you know, philosophy, all these different things. They all mingle together to kind of form how we should approach even the self for the individual for the most part. And if you do a disservice if you don't try and have a wider net, you know, and explore things that might not have been, you know, if, like you said, let's take the example of somebody that's in psychology, it's like they would, you know, mostly be exposed to psychology stuff, but there's so many different other things that would, you know, dovetail well with that outside of that disciplinary. And then you know, kind of what Krishna was talking about a little bit. It's just on the idea of, you know, doing a disservice. It's just like a lot of this stuff is very dense, you know, and it's going to take time to lay that foundation, that groundwork for, you know, not only ourselves, but, you know, the viewers and listeners to make sure that, you know, everyone's on the same page of like, okay, this discussion, you know, you need to have a base level of knowledge. And I think that, like I said, we've done a good job, especially you know, of laying it out and making it very easily to digest and follow along with this thread. And it's so interesting how at the beginning of the podcast, we'll start with this, you know, one thing, and it's just like as we go through, it's just like, okay, we talked about all these different things, but you can follow a single train or a thread all the way that connects all these individual points and make it so we can actually move forward with the conversation. And it's amazing to see.
Well, thank you. Yes, I actually like to use the term transdisciplinary more than interdisciplinary, because it makes the notion of everything interlapping rather than interlocking. And the particular theory that I call to kind of encompass everything that I do is called, and Dr. Coleman helped with this, atemporal humanistic praxis is the best form or terminology that I was able to come up with. So that's kind of what I do.
We got to dive into that deeper too. Atemporal humanistic praxis.
Well, that's what all these past 12 episodes have been practically, is atemporal humanistic praxis.
Yeah, but I think in terms of conceptual definition.
Yeah.
No, that's I was saying thread, dare I say rhizome? No.
Oh, boy.
The single connecting and a very mobile and active rhizome, I suppose.
But, you know, you're usually the one that says this all the time, Pan, but I'll be the one to say it this time. It's always a pleasure to do these, because you don't understand how, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, closed in, like, entrapping, I guess. There's a better word, but that's the only word that's coming to mind. It is to kind of be in situations where I can't really talk to people who may not have the background. I can talk about certain aspects and help them understand, but to be able to like really talk about something that I'm passionate about, but also apply it to things that actually are materially effective in the society that we're living in, really helps me. So this is like a very cathartic process for me, as much as I'm sure it is for both of you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
I'm glad we can help and to that. It's like I said, if you don't look outside of your, like you said, your field or anything like that, you know, each of us has a slightly different background when it comes to this stuff. Then it's just like, you're not doing yourself, you're doing yourself a disservice. You know, it's just like, you're not creating that whole individual that's, you know, always growing and always learning and stuff like that. So it's just like, yes, you might have become a quote unquote, like me, you know, master or whatever in your field, but it's just like, to be a well-rounded individual, you still have to be willing to learn, and especially taking that from people that might know something a little bit more than you do. And so, like I said, it's always a joy in each of these weeks kind of hearing, you know, like I said, where this train of thought is going kind of thing. Because I think we, like you said, there's many of those things in history that we all know about, but like connecting this thread interwoven in between each one is the more interesting aspect, and the way in which you do that is very masterful, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it a lot. Do.
Yeah, no, this would not be possible without you, and it's only going to get better because we have your solid bedrock of knowledge to depend on.
It would be possible without it. It just wouldn't be nearly as good, or no one would probably learn a whole lot from us. Maybe between me and Krishna, we could do a decent job, but nowhere would you bring Josh.
Thank you so much. Like I said, I hope that just with the conversations me and Krishna had today regarding like the new things that you've been doing with the company, I hope that a lot of this is also kind of infiltrating into some of the practices of how the company's going too, because I think it's very relevant as well.
And in those terms, we have to discuss that more deeply at some point.
Yeah, definitely. You want me to do an outro?
Yeah, let's do an outro.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everybody for listening. The listeners who have been following us since October, we have finally, after 12 episodes, if you count all the parts, reaching the solution stage. This does not mean we're going to leave history, because I love history, and I think we all love history, but we're going to start looking towards the future and actually changing ourselves from every other podcast that only looks at history to actually implementing solutions to the problems that we're doing. So without further ado, I just want to thank everybody who's been listening, and I want to thank Krishna and Pan for joining me on this journey so far.
Thank you for taking us along, Josh.
Always a joy. Thanks for tuning in, guys.